Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. In this episode, I'm speaking with Professor Armando Barrientos about his sweeping new book, Social Protection in Latin America. On this show, we're often thinking about social protection as tools to reduce poverty or improve human development outcomes or build resilience. In this interview, we'll explore the argument that social protection systems or institutions are also mechanisms of wage earner stratification. We'll talk about what that means, why it matters, and how it shapes the lives of millions across Latin America. We'll also discuss the crucial role of politics in shaping social protection and whether Latin America should aspire to the European model of a welfare state. From the influence of Latin American innovations on global practices to the future of social protection in the region, this conversation is packed with insights from a leading academic in this field. Armando Barrientos is Emeritus Professor of Poverty and Social Justice at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester and the author of the new book, Social Protection in Latin America. Welcome, Professor Barrientos.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
So let's launch straight into one of the central themes of your book, which is very concerned with what you term stratification. You write that social protection institutions are not engines of equality or poverty reduction, although they may secure those goals, but they are primarily engines of wage earner stratification. And this to me is not the way we normally think about social protection. So I wanted to start out by asking you, what do you mean by stratification here? And what is driving or causing it in your view?
Okay, perhaps a good entry point is to start from the very recent innovations in social protection, particularly social assistance, of doing impact evaluations of a specific program, especially conditional income transfers. So we select a sample, we see what change the introduction of a transfer has on the beneficiaries. And that has been a very significant step forward in developing our understanding of social protection programs and interventions, right? Now, of course, that's very good, but social protection not only has an effect on beneficiaries, but social protection programs also have an effect on society. They are embedded in society, in the economy, they are embedded in the politics of different countries. And that is very important. What I wanted to do was to extend this idea of studying the effects of different interventions by looking at the effects on society as a whole, not just on the beneficiaries. And what I discovered is that the main effects of social protection, taken broadly, is in terms of stratification within society. Perhaps I should also say that by social protection, I mean not just social assistance, but also social insurance and other types of programs like pension schemes and so on and so forth.
So when you were talking at the start there about impact evaluations, what you're pointing to is that social protection programs can have positive effects on the individual, but when you talk about stratification in your book, you're also pointing out that it leaves wage earners, I guess, stuck in different kind of categories. And I just wondered if you could unpack in your arguments what you mean a little bit more by that stratification that you see and that you observe.
Of course, if you look at Latin American social protection today, what you find is that basically there are two kinds of groups. One group are workers that work in larger firms. They tend to have access to pension schemes. They can save in individual retirement plans. Then you have another group of people who perhaps might not have a boss. They are self-employed or they work in very small firms. We usually describe them as informal workers. And those informal workers do not have access to the same kind of social protection that workers in large enterprises. So they usually have access only to social assistance. So the fact that you got sort of pension schemes and occupational pension scheme on the one hand and social assistance on the other is kind of dividing the population into different groups, right? That is perhaps why I made the concept of stratification central to the book, if you look at theories of of welfare states, for example, S.P. Anderson, he argues that what welfare states do is that they ensure that the status of different workers is kept separate. He says welfare states are not really an engine of equality or inequality reduction, but they actually focus on workers in different groups.
When it comes to trends in Latin America, you also point out that old age income security has been the dominant concern of social protection policy in Latin America. Is that partly what's driving the way these institutions have developed, and particularly that stratification?
Okay, you can look at social protection in different parts of the world, and you can probably consider some of them are pro-old, in that pension is the biggest spending category, right? And the most important category. And others are perhaps pro-young, that are more focused on families and children. So you got sort of pro-old and pro-young. People have considered this issue in different parts of the world, but particularly in European countries, right? And trying to work out why is it that some countries get pro-old and some countries get pro-young social security programs. Now, Latin America falls in the first category, is pro, in the sense that the majority of the public spending is on pensions. Argentina is about 14% of GDP, whereas the kind of expenditure and the program design directed at families only came really into play in the middle of the 1990s with the development of conditional income transfers. Before, there were very few programs or interventions that were directed at supporting families with children. And what we have seen since then, introduction of social assistance, is that many countries have developed conditional income transfers, as you know, supporting families with children, ensuring that children go to school, ensuring that they have access to healthcare. And all the kind of developments since then have emphasized that aspect. So there has been some kind of shift in Latin America from being strictly pro-old to being more concerned with families and children. In my view, it's not enough, but we're moving in the right direction. As to why, older people have a vote electorally, they are a much more attractive proposition than families or children that do not have the right to vote. The kind of fiscal liabilities associated with different kind of social protection programs are also very different. But to me, one that is very important is to do with politics. Basically, if you look at different countries in the world, pro-old countries do not have very competitive politics. Pro-young countries have much more of a competitive politics.
We've been talking a lot about that focus on pensions. There are also some very well-known social assistance programs that are more family and child-focused. In Latin America, I think of Bolsa Familia, for example, and Prospera, and some of those archetypal conditional cash transfers that are centred around children and children's welfare that have been exported to the world. So I'm just interested in your kind of schema here, whether you think those are prominent or emerging, or is it just that actually that for all that they're quite well known and famous, they just don't meet the same level of investment or level of coverage as some of those the traditional insurance schemes?
In terms of traditional pension schemes, the expectation is that workers will make contributions towards a pension fund. Individual retirement accounts is purely a saving account. There is a subsidy from the government whenever these pension schemes are in deficit. There is usually also some contribution by the government to actually run or manage or supervise or regulate these pension schemes. On the other hand, on social assistance, conditional income transfer programs and social pensions, sometimes they are described as non-contributory pensions. The funding comes from taxation, and the government then uses taxation to kind of fund these transfers. Now, if you make a comparison between the subsidies to pension schemes and the kind of budgets of social assistance, you will find that the subsidies to pension schemes are significantly larger compared to the social assistance budgets. I did a study of this actually in Brazil about 2008, so it's very old, but the numbers were very neat in the sense that the government transferred 2.5% of GDP to the pension scheme of civil servants to pay for around 1 million pensions. And the whole of Bolsa Familia, which covered 11 million households, was about 1/3 of 1% of GDP. And that is very common across all the countries in Latin America.
So I think it's really important, as you say, to kind of put that into the broader context of what governments are actually spending money on and who is protected by those investments. Let's talk about employment. We've talked a bit about how types of employment influence social protection institutions and what people can have access to. But you also talk about how those social protection systems and programs and the way those institutions develop, how they go on to influence the nature of employment that's available in countries. And just interested in what you mean by that and why you think that's the case.
Okay, well, perhaps the easier kind of way of looking into this is by making a comparison between pension schemes, occupational pension schemes, and social assistance. In occupational pension schemes, you tend to make contributions to a fund, and that you have a pension which is based on some rules and in terms of how it's calculated when you retire. So your social protection, your pension is really related to the kind of job that you do. Now, social assistance has no connection to your employment, in the sense that conditional income transfers, for example, are paid on the basis of families having children and having low income, basically informal employment. And they do not provide any direction as to what kind of job you should have, right? Or what kind of employment you should have. Now, that makes a lot more sense in the context of extractive industries, agriculture, temporary employment that doesn't repeat or where you can move from one job to another job. And so the presence of social assistance transfers kind of facilitates a more kind of flexible economy in terms of labor market, which is what characterizes Latin America.
It's interesting that you talked about that flexible kind of labour market, because I think another way of putting that might be the kind of labour market that's characterised by informality and a lot of people not having access to the formal jobs that come with some of these protections. We recently ran an episode on gig work or platform work that was focused on Southeast Asia. And in that episode, we rehearsed this argument that the rise of gig work has entrenched precariousness, and that's kind of slowed down the creation of more formal sector jobs and the protections that come with those traditionally. And that's an example of how employment trends might influence social protection coverage and the programs that are being developed, because in that episode we were talking about the different ways that governments were trying to design programs to kind of bridge the gap for gig workers that weren't receiving formal social protection but weren't necessarily paying into these savings type schemes. And I was just interested in whether you had any views or thoughts on how gig work fits into this chicken and egg dilemma that you're describing here, where the employment's creating the institutions, but then the institutions are potentially driving the kinds of employment as well.
Okay, let me start with an example, because I think this is quite important. If you consider a typical pension scheme in Latin America and in other parts of the world too, if you can consider an occupational pension scheme, they have, in terms of their rules, a number of years that you have to contribute to access a pension. Now, in Latin America, they tend to be very hard. So you need 25 years, in some cases even 30 years, of contributions to be able to access a pension, right? In the nature of labor markets in Latin America, this is a really difficult task to achieve. So let's suppose that you are a sort of low-paid worker. The chances that you will get 30 or 25 years of contributory employment in Latin America are very low. So the majority of workers that retire in Latin America retire on a minimum pension. It's kind of basic guaranteed pension that you can get, right? So for most workers in Latin America, the option is not really to have a high pension or a low pension. The issue is whether they are going to get enough years of contributions to actually access a pension as such when they retire. Now, if you take Latin America as a whole, right, take all the workers in Latin America, this is more or less the situation. For every 4 workers in Latin America, 2 are contributing to a pension scheme. The other 2 are not. Of the 2 that are contributing to a pension scheme, 1 in every 2 are going to manage the number of years of contribution to access a pension. So basically, 1 out of 4 workers can rest assured that they are going to actually manage to get a pension at the end of it. And if I could add to this just one additional point, where the funds that they have, where the contributions stay in the pension scheme, they usually go to workers that have much higher levels of wage and pension. So it's an inverse Robin Hood redistribution within pension schemes from kind of workers with low density of employment to workers with high density of employment. And I should say also from women to men for the same reason.
So what do you think about these efforts? And I think it's that kind of middle ground where you might try and encourage an informal worker to contribute to some kind of retirement plan, even if that plan doesn't mature to the degree that perhaps a formal sector pension would. I mean, where do you see these kinds of attempts? Are they worthwhile, or do they need to be really reconsidered?
Right. Yes, that was one of the justifications for governments to introduce individual retirement pension plans, because in an individual retirement pension plan, you just make contributions whenever you're working, and you hope by the time you reach retirement, there will be enough in the balance of your account to make pension arrangements. So the reformers in Latin America wanted to have that kind of flexibility, as it were. And again, you find another kind of demonstration of perhaps my argument in that individual retirement pension plans were introduced with the specific purpose of introducing greater flexibility in employment. So they tended to favor the kind of jobs like the gig economy that you mentioned, so that in countries that introduce individual retirement accounts, you find that a very high proportion of them reach retirement age with very little savings. And as a consequence, they really don't have a pension greater than the minimum pension or whatever the government can guarantee.
And in your book, you talk about the effects and outcomes of what all of this adds up to in Latin America in terms of what protections are afforded to different household types. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the difference in entitlements, particularly for people as they age. But I'd just be interested in your overall assessment of whether or not Latin American people are well protected by their social protection mechanisms and institutions, and perhaps what are some of the groups that you think are not getting the same level of coverage, and what does that look like?
To begin with, social protection in terms of access and in terms of the generosity of the protection is very unequal in Latin America. We already discussed that, but effectively you have 2 groups of people, right? Those that work in good jobs, that have access to an occupational pension, and those that work outside those good jobs and tend to have, at best, kind of social assistance, right? One of the motivations I have for writing this book is that this inequality has always been there. And if you read academics writing about social protection in the 1960s or 70s, you find the same story. So the thing is, why is it that if we had sort of 50, 70 years, since then, why is it that we're still in the same situation? So there must be factors that are very significant that prevent any kind of larger scale structural change to social protection. I think that social assistance, the emergence of social assistance in this century has been really important in terms of incorporating a large group of people, something like 1/3 of the population in Latin America, into some form of social protection. Clearly, it's not enough, and it's very unequal.
We've been talking about Latin America as a region, and of course it's a large region, a number of countries, all with histories and systems that have developed in different ways. And in your book you do talk about sort of clusters of countries that have had similar characteristics or perhaps been on similar trajectories. What are some of those similarities and contrasts between the way systems have grown up over time in different parts of the region, I guess, that stand out to you?
As far as I can see, there are 3 main clusters in Latin America. When you look at social protection, you look at different indicators and you group them. This is what you have. You get a group of countries that industrialized very early on. They're in the southern corner of Latin America: Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, right? I mentioned in the book that in 1890, Chile and Argentina had the proportion of the labor force working in manufacturing was about 25%, which was higher than the United States at that time. So they industrialized fairly early, and that led to perhaps being pioneers in terms of developing occupational pension schemes, right? Then you have another group of countries, in contrast to these, in Central America, that really did not industrialize at all. Their kind of development model was tied up to export of agriculture, so coffee and bananas in Central America. And so they never industrialized until the maquilas in the 1970s began to develop a small process of industrialization, but they never got that far. And then in the middle, you have what I call the Andean countries, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, that are mainly have extractive economies. Now, if you look at it in terms of social protection, then you have much higher levels of formal social protection in the early industrializers, a middle level in the Andean countries, and very, very low levels of social protection provision in Central American countries. Of course, in Latin America, we discuss a lot where the countries can break the mold. So Costa Rica is considered to be a country that broke the mold in terms of starting from a very export agriculture model and then kind of developing reasonable levels of social protection provision. Uruguay is another that again appeared to have kind of broken mold. I think today is Mexico. Mexico is moving in a direction that is not the same as other Latin American countries in terms of their social protection provision. But essentially, you got these three groups. And even if you go back to the 1960s and the 1950s, that kind of pattern was already set in place then.
Just to go to one of those examples, for example, Mexico, in what way do you see that as bucking the trend or breaking the mold compared to others?
Right. Partly it's to do with the fact that whereas in other countries, the kind of form of social protection has shown several cycles, right? So increases, decreases over time. In Mexico has been expanding fairly steady at very low levels. I mean, something like 30% of the labor force, thereabouts. And it has been very gradual, but there is no kind of significant reduction. There is no break over a long period of time. At the same time, social assistance has been expanded very significantly, not just in terms of pension provision, but also in terms of healthcare. And so you seem to have a situation where both formal insurance has been steadily, gradually rising, and social assistance has been expanded very rapidly. We have to remember that Mexico has very low tax revenue capacity. I think the central government collects something like 13% of GDP in taxes, 1/3, right? Compared to, say, 25% in Brazil. So that perhaps explains why you have this particular pattern. And perhaps integration with the US, as opposed to integration further down with Latin American economies.
So that segues quite nicely into my next question, because I know that you've also done some work trying to kind of correlate the growth of some of these social protection systems and, under what circumstances are governments prepared to invest in them, which is what it often comes down to. Can you draw any conclusions? If you look at sort of political trends or demographic trends or some of these broader trends, are there any conclusions to draw about what drives or constrains the development or expansion of systems? When do they flower and when do they wither and why?
I'm glad you asked me that question. Those of us that work or research on social protection, we focus a lot on the design of particular programs. So is it universal? Does it target? Is it selective, right? We focus a lot on the type of pensions. Is it an occupational pension or is it an individual retirement account? We focus a lot on design, but we don't focus enough on the politics of it. And if you push me against the wall and you ask me, why is it that after 70 years we still have this unequal, imperfect, and deficient social protection in Latin America? Mainly it's to do with politics. And that is another form of stratification, which is caused by social protection programs, because the origins of occupational pensions in Latin America in the 50s and 60s had to do with industrialization, creating an urban working class that managed to get the vote in the 1960s and 1970s and could exercise their political choice and options. And that led to the development of occupational pension schemes, because many elites try to co-opt workers by offering this as a means by which they could at least get some level of protection, right? It was a kind of response to the social demands in the 1960s and 70s. In the neoliberal period in Latin America in the 1990s and 90s, what governments tried to do was to, in fact, de-incorporate these workers from politics. And individual retirement accounts are precisely that, right? Your social protection is what you can save. There is no redistribution. There is no further protection. It's just you, right? So that was a mechanism of de-incorporation. And in fact, the reforms tended to expel labor organizations from the management and the running and the design of social protection programs. And then in the 2000s and onwards, with the expansion of social assistance, you have a connection between politicians, sometimes from left coalitions, but sometimes also from right coalition, a connection between them and informal workers and low-income workers that cannot be, as it were, taken seriously in terms of policy design. And that led to the development of social assistance. So I can see that different forms of social protection also have an impact on the politics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We've looked at how social protection institutions in Latin America have evolved. And of course, perhaps, even predating those, the archetypal European welfare states. And I'm interested in your views on whether the European model is what Latin American countries are aspiring to or should be building towards, or is that not a useful comparison to make in your view?
Okay, it's a yes and a no. Yes, Latin Americans have been aspiring to having the kind of social protection systems that you find in European countries. So that has been an aspiration. And that has also fed into these academic discussions about social protection. I think perhaps one of the things we haven't done well as academics working in this area is that we have taken for granted that this model is where our countries are going to go. I don't find that particularly attractive, because basically all you say is, well, Chile is not like Sweden, or Colombia is not like Germany, and so on. And I don't think that is very helpful. Also because as a resident in Europe, I think that the path that European countries have to establish their social protection is unique. It's not general. It's not for everyone. It's just unique to European countries following the Second World War that sort of created the conditions for the welfare state. So I think welfare states are a European form of doing social protection. The rest of the world has different paths. And I think Latin America has a different path to it.
So if that's the case, what should the objectives be and the way forward be for social protection institutions, but also reforms in Latin America? What's the path that you'd like to see them on, and what would look like progress or improvement to you?
Right. Well, I think in terms of the objectives, they are not very different to any other part of the world, including European countries. So that is to do with having social protection systems that are inclusive, that are well established, that are rules-based, so that, they are robust in terms of their governance, that they tend to pay more attention to social investment, and they are not gendered, as we have now. So in terms of the objectives, they are not really that different. The difficulty is where we are. And it's hard for me to see, how you can achieve those objectives with the kind of institutions that you have at the moment. For example, to reduce the kind of inequality in the generosity of support for different groups in the population, you are going to have to reduce the generosity for some, as well as increase the generosity for others. And I find that it's a very hard kind of policy to follow.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the relevance of the different forms of social protection, social insurance, social assistance, and the relative disparity, for example, in the way that governments invest in those. But as I was also saying, earlier, Latin America has played a pioneering role in many of the developments of social protection, and perhaps particularly around social assistance in low and middle income countries. Uruguay was an early adopter of cash transfers for older persons. Bolsa Familia and Prospera, of course, major sources of evidence for cash assistance, particularly to families and conditional cash transfers in Brazil and Mexico. And you'll often see Argentina's more universal child benefits being used as great examples for those who are promoting universalisation or universal approaches to social protection and so on. So there's a lot that comes out of Latin America that gets exported to the world. What do you think of the way these ideas have been exported and the way that they have spread in different regions? Are other regions still learning from Latin America? Are they learning the right things, I guess is the question.
That's an interesting question. You left out Europe, by the way, but Europe has also learned from Latin America. In the UK, for instance, you have individual retirement accounts, which were transferred from Chile by the Margaret Thatcher government, right? And they are now the dominant form of provision of pension. And they are as bad in the UK as they are in Latin America, by the way. They are not any better just because they are located in the European countries. There are conditional income transfers in several countries, including very localized examples, sort of some cities in Italy, for example. The city governments have introduced conditional income transfers. So that has also fed through there. But you asked me about the other regions of the world, and I think that they tend to value and they tend to learn a great deal from Latin America, certainly in Africa. I was invited at least a couple of times to provide some advice in African countries because they thought that I was Brazilian rather than Chilean, right? So but Brazil had a very significant influence on African countries in terms of the development of their social protection. In Asia, it was much later, but it's happening too. I remember going with a group of my students on fieldwork to the Philippines. This must be about 2003, 2004. And we were hosted by a university there. And they asked me to give a presentation. So I gave a presentation on social pension. And they really didn't like it at all. They said, you are insulting us. We look after our old people. We don't need social pensions. And then 10 years later, the government of the Philippines introduced a social pension. So I think the lessons are being kind of transmitted. And I think that is excellent. That instead of kind of everything coming from London, Washington, the lessons are transferred across developing regions.
You have been writing about social protection for decades now. Why has this been of such interest to you?
The motivation I have for studying social protection over a long period of time is very straightforward. I really believe in social justice. And I think that if there is a measure of social justice in different countries, is the extent to which their social protection has been developed and the inequalities it has or the kind of positive impacts it has. So social protection gives you an entry into social justice, and it enables you to measure whether we are progressing or we are regressing in terms of social justice. So that is my main motivation.
Looking back over the many years of your academic career, I'm curious about how your thinking has changed on this topic. Are there assumptions or beliefs that you might have held many years ago that you've changed your mind about as a result of emerging evidence or different experiences?
Yes, lots, really. I began my research interest in social protection by looking at pension schemes and health insurance in Latin America. A lot of colleagues said to me, yeah, but that is just a very selective group of workers. What about the majority of the population? So I was wrong in that. Luckily, when social protection began to develop and take off, I was already interested in it and I was working on that too. So that is one change, really. We have to look at social protection as a whole rather than what appeared to me the more formal kind of institutions within it. The other one is, I thought initially that you could actually use quite a lot of the models of social protection in European countries in Latin America and elsewhere. And I have come to a conclusion that, as I said, they're very unique and that the development path will be quite different in other regions.
Do you see examples that inspire you, or examples from the region perhaps where you feel like that's the kind of innovation that we'll need to see, or that would perhaps define the uniquely Latin American trajectory?
Oh, yeah, I think so. And even in difficult times, you tend to see a lot of creativity. I think with COVID-19, there was a great deal of creativity. Suddenly, governments had to reach large sections of the population with support, and they did manage to do that. And in fact, the administrative structure of social protection helped a lot to achieve that. So that is important. Perhaps the most important one for me is that since 2000, Latin American governments have accepted responsibility for poverty reduction. Poverty reduction and inequality reduction is their job. And I think that is a very significant change. And I hope that continues in the future.
That was something that really struck me in your book as well, that there had been that shift from, the ministries of finance or employment to kind of shifts around those ministries of social affairs that really demonstrate that government is seeing this as their roles. Professor Barrientos, thank you so much for such a sweeping overview and really rich discussion about how social protection has evolved and is evolving in Latin America. We will link to your book in our show notes. And thank you again for joining us on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you very much to you for inviting me to do this. And I was looking forward to it. Many thanks. It's been really interesting.
We like to end each episode with some recommendations or quick wins, items that have sparked our interest and that we think you should know more about. Today, our quick wins are coming to you from the Social Protection Podcast production team at socialprotection.org. Food security and hunger are topics we've covered frequently on this show, and we wanted to highlight a new set of resources that have been prepared to underpin the new Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, which has been a major initiative for Brazil in its role as chair of the G20 this year. These are a series of notes from the task force that has been shepherding the Global Alliance, with contributions from the FAO, FCDO, GIZ, UNICEF, WFP and the World Bank. The focus is finding ways forward on financing to fight global poverty and hunger, for rural development and to build resilience towards shocks. And, of course, social protection is a big part of the story. The Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty will be launched alongside the G20 Leaders Summit in November. I also wanted to mention a new systematic review that caught my eye of the relationship between cash-based interventions and violence by Machado et al. We've talked, of course, about social protection and intimate partner or gender-based violence on this podcast before. This review goes further to look at the impact of cash transfers on child maltreatment, suicide, youth violence, general violence, alongside intimate partner violence. And although the evidence was mixed, the review found good evidence of cash transfers contributing to the reduction in rates of suicide, intimate partner violence, and violence against children. It's well worth a look, and a hat tip to Ugo Gentilini's blog for that one. And finally, listen out next week for a bonus episode in your feeds, marking the 9th anniversary of the socialprotection.org platform. Across the platform, we're celebrating partnerships for social protection. In our bonus episode, my guests are from the ILO and the World Bank, which are co-chairs of the Social Protection Interagency Cooperation Board, that's SPIAC-B, and the Universal Social Protection 2030 campaign. We talk about how partnerships work to build common ground amidst the policy differences that can characterise our sector, and keep the pressure on to expand social protection globally. And thank you for listening to the Social Protection Podcast, brought to you by socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. And be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.